how would it strike you if you knew nothing about it, if you'd never heard of it before, if you opened up the covers of this book for the first time? The very beginning is the Gospel of Matthew, and it starts like this. The book of the origin, or the Genesis is the Greek word, of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had Judah and his brothers. Judah had Phares and Zerah from Tamar. And you know how this goes, right? This is the begats, the famous begats that start the Gospel of Matthew. So-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so. And it goes on like this for sentences and sentences and sentences. And as a modern person, you're going, what is this? What's going on with this? And then you get to the birth narratives in Matthew, the stories of the baby Jesus. If you lived during the time of Matthew himself, all of this stuff would seem fairly familiar to you. The idea that kings would come from far off and see a star, and that meant that the birth of someone great had been born. This is actually part of propaganda culture of the ancient world. If you were an ancient person and you picked up the Gospel of Matthew and you heard these stories about these kings from the east following a star and arriving and finding this baby, that would sound, okay, this is going to be somebody great. This is telling you that this is himself a king or somebody great. So it would sound familiar to you in the ancient world. Then you'd go on and read the rest of the Gospel of Matthew. It's a story of a man who travels around giving speeches, sometimes talking to people or teaching. He's exorcising demons, performs a few miracles, he heals people. And again, to us in the modern world, if you didn't already had some exposure to religious narratives like this, that would sound odd. In the ancient world, actually, it would have sounded familiar because there were other stories of other kinds of teachers who healed and exorcised demons and performed miracles. That was not an uncommon way to talk about someone who was supposed to be great. But then you get to the next book in the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. Well, it's kind of the same story. It's shorter. There's fewer teachings in it. So why do you have the second chapter of this book retell the same story that the first chapter of the book told? The Gospel of Luke, same thing. You get to the Gospel of John. John's kind of different. It sounds different. There's a different style. But again, it's the same story of this same guy. Why do you have 4 different chapters of this book all telling the same story? That's odd in itself from our point of view, or it should look odd to us. Then you get to the Acts of the Apostles. Now we're back on more familiar ground. It starts off like the Gospel of Luke. This is because it's written by the same guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And in fact, it starts off with a paragraph that kind of encapsulates how the Gospel of Luke ended. You know, like TV shows. Last time on ER. And this is the way the Acts of the Apostles begin. Last time in Luke, it ended this way. Now we're going to take up our heroes at their next point. Then it starts sounding like a Greco-Roman novel. And I have to tell you something about novels in the ancient world. There were Greek and Latin novels. Greek novels usually were about a man and a woman, young, rich, who see each other and fall madly in love and passionately want one another. And they might get married and they might not get married, but they don't get to consummate their love. Instead, one of them gets kidnapped or has to go off to war or captured by pirates. And she's taken out by pirates and sold into slavery, and she goes all the way around the Mediterranean, and the young man follows her around the Mediterranean in chapter after chapter after chapter. They always almost connect and almost get to have sex, and then she's bought by somebody else and taken into another slave job, or he's captured by pirates. And so the whole novel is them chasing each other around the Mediterranean with shipwrecks and battles and miracles and gods intervening and all kinds of stuff. And that's what the Acts of the Apostle kinds of looks like. It looks like an ancient Greek novel, except it lacks the one thing every good Greek novel had: sex. The Acts of the Apostles doesn't have sex. You might be disappointed there, but you also have other things that the novels don't have, such as the Holy Spirit being the main actor for the whole thing. But notice, that would look kind of familiar to you in the ancient world. It definitely looks odd to you in the modern world if you don't read it as the Bible and if you just read it as literature. And you also realize that the Acts of the Apostles is mistitled. It's not the Acts of all the Apostles. It's the Acts basically of Paul. And Paul's not considered an apostle by the guy who wrote the Acts of the Apostles. This is another little clue here we'll learn in this semester. The titles of most of the books in the New Testament were not put there by their authors. They were put there by later Christian scribes. This will be very important. Then you get to the letters of Paul. And is it strange that most of the New Testament are actually letters? They're not like modern letters. They're quite a bit like ancient letters. They're usually addressed to groups of people, and they deal with sort of philosophical-sounding issues, and they give advice on group problems. Then you get to the Epistle to the Hebrews, or in what a better translation would be, the letter to the Jews. What's odd about it is that as you read this Epistle to the Hebrews, you realize two things. Number one, it's not a letter. It's actually a sermon. In fact, it doesn't even claim to be a letter. It looks just like a sermon. And you realize this is not really addressed to Jews. It seems to be addressed to Gentile Christians to convince them that Jesus provides for them a liturgy that is superior to Judaism. It's actually neither a letter, nor is it addressed to Jews. This leads to an insight, though, by this time, when you're surveying your New Testament. These letters seem to be meant to be read out loud. So we'll ask this over and over again this semester. What would it mean to read this letter out loud in a community, not alone in your dorm room or just by yourself in the library? Then you get to 1 Peter. It's written not to one place, but it's a circular letter meant to be circulated around. Then you get to 2nd and 3rd John, two letters that are written to the elected lady and her children. What does that mean? Then finally you get to the Revelation of John, the Apocalypse. The word revelation is just the Latinized English version of the Greek word apocalypse. And apocalypse just means opening up, revelation. This document is really bizarre. It's not like anything you've confronted so far in the New Testament. It starts off with a narrative about a vision. This guy named John says, I was on the island of Patmos, I was in the Lord's Day, I started having this vision, and this angel put me, and this all happened. Then it has several letters, 7 different letters, very short letters, addressed to 7 different Christian churches. And then it goes into this wild video game, MTV-style narrative of a heavenly journey of this guy, John. He goes up into the heavens. He sees the throne room of God. He sees weird kinds of beasts and animals that have like their bodies of lambs, but they've got horns and they're bleeding all over the place. It's a story of catastrophes. It's a story of a cosmic battle between forces of good and forces of evil. It's like several installments of Star Wars. And finally, it ends up with the establishment of a new world and a new city of God. Now, that's a long way. That's the end of the New Testament. That's a long way from the little baby Jesus and the 3 kings in Matthew, isn't it? But the New Testament includes all that kind of diverse literature. 27 different books written anywhere from the year 50 to the year 150. So a 100-year period of time that these books were probably written in. They have different points of view, different situations, different theologies, different genres. They use confusing in-house language. I'll point out that in-house language throughout the semester, and we'll talk about how it should be interpreted. And these texts almost defy interpretation by a modern person unless you have guidance from a historian and expert like moi.